Local will deliver scoops, offer sharp insights, and curate the best local reporting. Our events, called Smart Take, will help readers better understand the most consequential news unfolding in their own backyards. With Local, we focus on what matters in your community.
Welcome to our virtual event on improving housing affordability through city planning. I'm Thomas Wheatley, Axios Local Atlanta reporter. I'm coming to you today from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and hashtag Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll examine the intersection of local workforce and business growth, community planning, and solutions for addressing housing affordability in Atlanta and beyond. Our first guest is the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Dr. Raphael Bostic. Welcome, Dr. Bostic.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. We're very happy to have you. I want to jump right into it. Your research and experience with affordable housing, it runs very deep and it goes very far back. From your perspective, how far along has the U.S. come in addressing that issue? Are we further along? Have we not made that much progress? What would you say?
It's a very interesting question. For me, I actually think we're pretty much the same place that we were when I started in this, which is affordability is a challenge for many communities. And the challenge requires action by so many different players that it's hard to take big chunks and move it from the problem area into the solved area. My experience really says that to solve affordable housing, you need every city council in America, every mayor to be focused on this, and everyone to understand their role. That's just a huge task. And when you have so much turnover in public officials and in people in those positions, it just makes the task that much harder.
And that's especially true with a place like Metro Atlanta, where, and I know that you saw this in California, where you have not just so many counties, but also in those counties, cities, and all those various just local jurisdictions. What are some of the other biggest challenges to building affordable housing today? I'm sure funding is still a big one.
Yeah, well, let me just get back to that other thing you said, because I do think it is really an important point that the more disaggregated governance is in a region, the more difficult it is, I think, going to be to solve the problem, because then you need each of those localities individually to be making decisions. And that means that there needs to be sort of a broader view and a collective understanding that every community has a role to make. So as a role to play in solving it. Now, in terms of, some of the other challenges, I think just building enough units is something that is plaguing a lot of places. You mentioned Atlanta. I lived in Los Angeles before. LA was thousands of units behind. And that sets up an auction environment where every unit is going to go to the highest bidder. And that's necessarily going to push prices up and bring affordability down. Availability of land is a challenge in many places. But then another thing I think people also don't talk about enough is that affordability is a ratio. And it's the cost of housing divided by income. And so we should also be thinking about, what things can we do to make sure that families are making enough money so that they can afford the prevailing levels of pricings that we see in many of these markets. In too many places, we have families that are working 2 and 3 jobs just to get through with basic things. And that means that affordability is just going to be a perpetual problem.
Are there solutions that you've seen in your work recently at the Atlanta Fed about, what are things that are working? Community land trusts, inclusionary zoning, things along those lines. Do you see glimmers of hope?
Well, there are glimmers of hope. A couple things I would say. So I do think that efforts to increase the amount of housing that's available in a community are quite important. And some of the things that have worked have been things like inclusionary zoning, where we say if we're going to build units, we're going to build them at all price levels, so that as we're trying to deal with our supply problem, we see relief happen across the entire distribution. We also see movements to try to promote the development of things like tiny homes, which mean that you can get more units on a particular parcel. That can add units. And then there's been a lot that's been done recently on accessory dwelling units, or the granny flats that allow homeowners to add units on their parcel or property. And those are ways to create density without necessarily getting verticality in communities, which often makes people nervous. So all of those are, I think, really interesting things. And ultimately, I think the solutions in many of these communities are going to have to be all of the above. We're going to have to find ways to get new types of housing units. We're going to have to think about our zoning restrictions. We're going to have to think about the type of land that's available. One other thing I would say that it's also quite interesting. In many cities, the transportation agencies are very large owners of land. Schools are very large owners of land. And if you look at the land use around them, a lot of these have parking lots and things that are not really used during the time that you would think that the schools would be needed. And so I think about, say, a school, for example. The teachers are there during the day. At night, when you might be having residents, those parking lots are often empty. And so a solution I've seen that's been quite interesting has really been to build a partnership between the schools, between the transit agencies and housing, so that we get these dual uses on parcels that can increase the productivity of every parcel in the city.
And you mentioned a really interesting point, because we've seen a little bit of that here in Atlanta, but we're running into issues where there's neighborhood opposition or concern about that. Most recent example, I think, was in the zoning reform law that Atlanta was considering. How do you have that conversation with communities about, hey, why this is important in the long run?
Well, I think there are two angles to this. The first is that there's been a long history of opposition to affordable housing, where communities have often been afraid that by bringing in people that had lower incomes, that you were going to bring in problems that you saw in the big public housing projects in the 1960s and 1970s up through today. I think the experience of how people build affordable housing today and how they're managed tells a very different story. And that's a story that many don't know and they don't understand. So part of the conversation has to be, look, we can allay the general fear and the concern by showing you what happens in neighborhoods that have this type of housing. And typically, the experience is quite positive. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is really just to talk about it in a more general context. So when I think about affordable housing, the thing I try to tell people is the lack of affordable housing is far more costly than you might originally think. So if you think about longer commutes, that is often because people don't have housing close to where they work, so they got to drive places. If you think about poor performance in schools, we know that when families have to move from place to place, the children do worse. And so there are a whole host of other costs that we see in our communities that you can actually go back and say it has a direct link to affordable housing or the lack of affordable housing. And if we can get the housing settled, a lot of these other things will take care of themselves as well.
Jumping to the interest rates right now, what are you hearing in your conversations with banks, executives, your regional executives, about how those interest rates are affecting the development of affordable housing, if so?
So, interest rates are an interesting thing. They definitely affect affordability because most people can't pay for a house cash. So they're going to have to get some debt financing, and the cost for that financing is higher, particularly when we think about ownership. But the second part of this is a lot of affordable housing requires subsidy. And that subsidy doesn't go as far when you've got to have, when you're facing higher costs. But all that to be said, as a Federal Reserve official, I feel like I have to say this, our first line goal is to get inflation back down to a 2% level. Because when inflation comes down and gets under control, all these other costs that are elevated now will come back into a more normal kind of context, and affordability will rebound. So we've got a short run problem. We've got inflation that's too high. We got to get that taken care of. Once that's taken care of, then we will then have the just sort of your garden variety affordable housing challenges about availability of units and not enough income for families.
We focus a lot on rentals when we talk about affordable housing. We only got a little bit of time left, but I did wonder if you have any ideas on how we can increase Black home ownership in cities.
Well, I think the most important things are, one, we've got to make sure that Black families are as productive as possible so they get the most income that they possibly can. Two, we need to make sure that they understand what tools are available to them and what financial instruments there are available so that their money goes as far as it possibly can. And three, we need to make sure that there is a social capital and social network that is created so that we all can learn from each other's experiences and not make the same mistakes that we might have otherwise. I think historically, we've seen challenges in the Black community in all three of those dimensions. And if we can get those fixed, I think we can see the Black homeownership rate increase in a very positive way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bostic. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thanks for joining us.
Really pleased to be part of this program and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, sir. Up next, we have a View from the Top segment with Chris Frakes.
Hey, thanks, Thomas. And thank you to our sponsor, the American Planning Association, for making this conversation possible. And joining me now is the president of the Georgia Planning Association, Whitney Shepard. Whitney, welcome to Axios.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm excited to talk with you, and I want to start at the 30,000 foot here because I'm wondering, why is housing so critical to economic development and growing jobs? I'm wondering, what trends are you seeing nationally?
Well, simply put, the nation's growing jobs faster than we're producing housing. And those jobs are locating in higher cost of living places without enough housing for workers, or in low cost places with low capacity to develop new homes. And housing supply challenges in places with high job growth are particularly hard on employers and their employees. Research shows that a jobs housing mismatch leads to low quality of life for families, reduces worker productivity, and it increases turnover. All of that makes it hard for employers to attract and retain employees. And Georgia really illustrates this problem. The Peach State enjoys high job growth and economic success, but we have very real housing challenges, including how to ensure future housing supply can keep pace with and support continued growth. The Georgia Department of Labor projects more than 500,000 jobs by 2028. But a 2019 housing underproduction report showed that Georgia was already short 120,000 housing units. With 500,000 jobs coming to our state, we really should plan for that growth. And of course, we're not the only state struggling to supply attainable housing. 46 other states face housing scarcity at all levels of income. And across the United States, we're short almost 4 million homes. Housing is complex, but we understand that outdated regulations create barriers to affordability, economic growth, and development.
I want to talk a little bit about those barriers because I wonder what can Georgians do? How can that state continue to retain, to attract, and then house that enormous workforce that is going to come in to fill those jobs?
Well, here in Georgia, those national trends really mean that our aircraft assemblers and tire builders and technicians and the thousands of hard workers that power our innovation and economic boom don't have stable, equitable housing options to stay in their communities and thrive. And that lack of quality, attainable housing where jobs are threatens the Peach State's position as the #1 state for business. From our cities to our small towns, Georgia leaders need community planners to help identify and unlock housing options. Both Governor Kemp and the General Assembly have to work with our counties and our cities to encourage locally driven change, to enable community planners to overhaul codes that constrain housing supply, drive up costs, and delay job-creating development. The state should incentivize workforce housing strategies that we know increase supply, meet the need for quality homes for families. Because families deserve housing choice, and the state should provide local housing policy incentives that promote options, along with the incentives that they're providing to attract business.
So can you give me an example of where this work is happening? How's it playing out? And what role are planners in particular playing?
Yes, that's a good question. The city of Chamblee is a great example of where zoning reform can spur redevelopment, economic growth, and housing supply. Chamblee is a suburb turned town center. After World War II, it was in a booming industrial area, home to companies like Frito-Lay, Kodak, and GE. And the city really benefited from that tax base and the employment. But in the 1980s, as manufacturing companies downsized or closed altogether, the city saw a shrinking tax base and a shrinking population as young workers moved to faster growing suburbs. Meanwhile, their connection to Atlanta, 25 miles away, drew an increasingly diverse workforce seeking both housing and employment. And years ago, city leaders saw the need to rethink zoning to address the needs of a diverse working community in need of housing. So they prioritized planning for housing. Out of a really forward-thinking comprehensive plan came a study of housing supply, demand, and market trends, an update to their overall housing strategy, and participation in the Georgia Initiative for Community Housing. That means today, companies like Patillo Industrial Real Estate put down roots in Chamblee specifically because of their livable, pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods. Land use reforms like reduced parking requirements and increased housing types resulted in more housing choice across the city. Chamblee's really 10 to 15 years ahead of many of our state's communities, investing in diverse mixed-use redevelopment and responding to the need for workforce housing. Chamblee's success is a testament to the power of planning to respond to residents' needs and to breathe new life into our cities.
So Chamblee is a great example. And I wonder if you're in other communities throughout the country, what can they do? How can they best respond to their own workforce housing needs? How can they be more like Chamblee?
Well, the first step is to plan. Chamblee's commitment to housing was really led by planners who could effectively guide investment to places with the most impact while keeping what people loved about where they lived. Georgia has economic development wins across our state, and we should celebrate that. But we're so busy cutting ribbons that we're not planning to make that growth sustainable. Without housing for employees, families can't create lives where their jobs are locating. Planners provide data-driven insights, an understanding of broad community impact, and a long-term perspective to help decision makers accelerate housing production and right the jobs housing mismatch across towns in every corner of our state. Policymakers in Georgia and beyond should look to planning to grow our communities as our economies grow new jobs.
Whitney Shepard is the president of the Georgia Planning Association. Whitney, I think we have to leave it there, but the takeaway being it's always good to plan. Thank you so much for joining Axios.
Thank you.
And now back to Thomas.
Thanks, Chris. Our final guest today is the Senior Housing Policy Advisor for the Mayor's Office of Atlanta, Joshua Humphreys, also joining us from Atlanta. Hey, Josh, thanks for being here.
Hey, glad to be on.
Want to jump right into it. People often think of affordable housing in terms of subsidies, but there's more than just that. How can city planners and city planning play a role in preserving and increasing the supply of affordable housing in cities?
Sure. I think that's a really important question. Subsidy, you're right, plays a big role. And I think when we're thinking about affordable housing, there's often a gap between what it costs to build something and the cost to make it affordable for residents. But there are a few areas where I think that city planning and public policy can play an important role. One of those is in the design of the units themselves, right? For the last several decades, maybe longer than that even really, the size of housing units has continued to grow. And as those units grow, that means that larger bathrooms and larger amenity space, and that adds costs to development. So we're increasingly interested in ways that we can see smaller footprint units and more diverse units. One of the big things that's changed over the last 15, 20 years in the US is the shrinking in household sizes. So the household sizes have gotten smaller. Many of the units and the types of housing we see have stayed the same or even gotten larger. And so as we look at the next 20, 30, 50 years of the city, I think it's important to look at ways we can creatively take up a little bit less space with our units and allow for the units themselves to be cheaper just based on the sheer design of them. The other thing that I think is really important is around preservation, right? So thinking about strategically where we can preserve existing housing stock, because it was a little bit smaller and currently exists, being able to preserve those units and make sure that they're still high quality units, but are more affordable because they're older housing stock, can be really critical to an overall housing supply in a healthy neighborhood.
Does the city have a good handle on where those affordable units are in terms of where are subsidies expiring, where are neighborhoods where maybe there could be gains made from public investment or anything like that? Or is there still an information gap that y'all have to contend with?
So we have a pretty good handle on where we have existing subsidized units, right? Because we have to track that for compliance purposes or otherwise. What is a little harder to track is what we typically call in housing spaces naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is some 1960s two-story brick building that you've probably passed 100 times that charges $800 a month in rent, but they're not reporting to CoStar and they're not subsidized units. Functionally, they're providing affordable housing in the city, and that's a little bit harder to track down. What our goal is on those, though, is to see how we can get involved with them and keep them affordable while they get improved over time. Because one of the biggest challenges, right, with older multifamily is they either get torn down or they get renovated to the point that they're no longer affordable. And so a big priority of ours, and just a week ago, we passed a new $100 million housing bond with a focus on preservation of those units so that we can renovate them, but put public dollars in to actually bring subsidy into the deal. So we were able to attract them, ensure compliance, and keep them affordable no matter what happens in the neighborhood.
Yeah. What are other cities doing right? What are some other approaches that you've seen across the country that you'd like to try here? And also, what are some other initiatives that you're working on in terms of city planning and affordability?
Yeah. So one thing that I'm particularly keen on that I think ties in with this whole conversation around city planning and housing affordability and intersection is the work that we're doing on public land development. And so this past year, we participated in a cohort of putting assets to work. And that was with several other U.S. cities. And we looked at both U.S. and international examples of how public land has been put to use for a variety of reasons, but really thinking about how to maximize land assets. Because one of the things that I think has been a real priority, it's been a priority of the Dickens administration, but it's true of Atlanta, is that we have a lot of underutilized publicly owned land. And so we started looking at this need for affordable housing, the existing vacant land, and started asking how can we best use that land to help us address our affordable housing needs. Cities all over the world have really developed strong development capacities to take their land, to set public benefit standards around them, say, hey, we want 25 or 30 or 50% affordability, and then use a ground lease or take some kind of a long-term stake so that it's not only the short-term to 5, 10, 15 years of affordability, but the life of that ground lease can keep it affordable over time. And so after looking at cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam and Singapore and really, I mean, honestly, there's like international cities, particularly in Europe, have done a great job of this, taking that and trying to bring that model here, looking at the land assets we have and the neighborhoods that we know need investment, not just in affordable housing, but housing of all types and key amenities. And we're really, I think that's what we've learned a lot in the last year and are working to implement is public land development in a way that thinks about whole, healthy neighborhoods and takes the long view. You know, our goal is not just, yes, we have a goal to build as many affordable housing units as possible, but our goal is not just build affordable housing units. Our goal is really to think about the entirety of a neighborhood and how we can contribute to healthy food access and sidewalks and transportation access, quality schools, and housing is a baseline of that, right? You need quality housing that's accessible to people across all income levels as part of that work. And so for us, you know, we think that our public land can really help us unlock that in areas that we have a decent amount of public land ownership. And so that's the work that we're doing, right? We just are in the final stages right now in Thomasville Heights, an area in southeast Atlanta, for a small area plan that we worked with the neighborhood to say, hey, what does the future of this neighborhood look like? And oftentimes, when city planning staff will work to do a small area plan, that area plan, unfortunately, often gets put on a shelf somewhere, and only a limited amount of it gets implemented. But because we are working to develop our public land at the same time that we're completing these small area plans, we are in an implementation-oriented mode. So we're able to step right into that situation and say, okay, this plan is now done. We own the properties that a lot of the planning was done on, and we've got really a situation where we can leverage that and say, okay, we need an early childhood center, and we need affordable housing, and we really need a grocery store. And over the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to work to leverage our public land to begin building those things. And I think that's what's, to me, I think unique about the work we're doing in Atlanta, and really inspiring, because it allows us to draw the connection between planning work and actually the implementation on the ground in a really tangible way.
Got it. Is it possible for a large city like Atlanta to make strides on affordable housing without increasing density?
So I think when we're talking about density, at the end of the day, I think the question to me is not about density or no density. The question is like, how do you allow for a city to grow in a way that makes the city work better? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, I think that's the role that planning can play, thinking about where growth makes sense, where growth doesn't make sense, and how to grow in ways that contribute to a more vibrant city. So areas like downtown Atlanta, I'm sitting in 2 Peachtree Street right now, and it's a property. Oh, and the lights just went out. Oh, here we go. And we're in the process of redeveloping this right in downtown to bring several hundred new housing units into the urban core. Areas like downtown Atlanta, more residential density will make the area work better. That means more restaurants. That makes the transit work better, because you have more people that are able to ride transit. And bringing more people to downtown Atlanta actually takes pressure off of the greater metro Atlanta region and the city. And so at the end of the day, the metro area is growing. We've been a metro area that's growing for the last 50 years. The city of Atlanta has grown a ton in the last decade and stands to continue growing. That's the challenge before us. I think that as we look at that, we have to ask the question and think really thoughtfully about how do we make space for the people that want to move here? Because if we don't make space for them, it'll become increasingly unaffordable, right? Just basic supply and demand of housing, that if we don't create enough housing stock for residents at the income levels and the price points they need, at the end of the day, it will end up hurting the poorest and most vulnerable residents of the city. So it's incumbent on us to create that housing. And I think from a density standpoint, to create it in areas of the city that contribute positively to the character of the overall area.
Final 30 seconds here. But how do you make the argument to a community, to a developer, a city official, whoever, why affordable housing is needed? How do you show them it's a benefit?
At the end of the day, we're all interconnected. And in order for us to have a thriving city that we're all proud of, we need to have housing stock that's available for people, no matter if they're, the mayor likes to say this, whether the bus driver, the teacher, or the principal, they can all live in the same neighborhood. And when we create neighborhoods like that, I think we open up ourselves to be the city, I think, that we all aspire Atlanta to be, an inclusive place that's approachable and accessible to everyone, and in a quality neighborhood that we can all be proud of and have access to the amenities that we want to have in life. And if we don't have the variety of housing stock that we need to have, then we'll fail. I think we'll fail to be the best version of ourselves as a city.
Cool. Thank you for your time, Josh. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. For more information or to sign up for the Axios Local Atlanta newsletter, visit axios.com/local or on the Axios app. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.